I'm a man in my 40s. I'm married. I was lucky enough to find someone. For a long time, I had this vague assumption. By the time you hit this age, most people are settled, married, maybe with kids, living some version of a stable life. But lately, when I look around, it feels very different. A lot of people my age are still single, or they were married and now they're not. More than I expected. And what's interesting is, when you actually talk to them, they all say something very similar. I can't do it. I can't find the right person. I don't even know if I want to anymore. And the strange part is, those words don't feel distant to me, because I remember thinking the same things before I got married. Money, time, the effort it takes to maintain a relationship, and that constant question in the back of your head, is this even the right move? Back then, I thought those were just personal struggles, my own doubts. But looking back now, I don't think that's what it was. Something bigger was shifting, something structural. So I started wondering, is this just a phase? Are people changing? Or is it simpler than that? The decision that used to make sense just doesn't make as much sense anymore. When you zoom out, this isn't happening in one place. The United States, Europe, East Asia, different cultures, different systems. But the direction is similar. Less dating, less marriage, fewer children. And right in the middle of that shift, you start to notice something else. Men quietly stepping back. So over the next few episodes, I want to take a peek at this. Different regions, different structures. What's actually changing, and why? Why does marriage feel like a harder decision now? Not emotionally, but structurally. Today, we start with the United States. On the surface, the US looks like the easiest place to date. Big cities, a melting pot of people, apps everywhere, endless options. It feels like opportunity is unlimited. From the outside, it's easy to say, if you can't find someone here, that's on you. There are so many options, what's the problem? But when you actually step inside the system, the experience is very different. It doesn't feel like abundance. It feels like nothing is happening. You send messages, no reply. You match, the conversation goes nowhere. You try again, same result. A few times you brush it off, but after a while, something shifts. It stops feeling like rejection and starts feeling like invisibility. That's the key difference. Rejection still means you were seen. This is different. You're in the system, but the system doesn't include you. And this isn't just anecdotal. A significant number of Americans say dating has become harder than it was a decade ago. And among younger groups, a large share of men report being single, much more than women in the same age range. So it's not just men not trying. In many cases, they are trying. Which brings up the first common explanation. Men are lazy now. They're not putting in the effort. That's an easy answer, but it doesn't really hold up. Because most men don't start by giving up. They try, at least for a while. They try, nothing happens. They try again, nothing happens. And at some point, that stops feeling random. It starts to look like a pattern. And the moment it becomes a pattern, the interpretation changes. It's no longer, maybe I'm not good enough. It becomes, maybe this isn't designed to work for me. And that's where effort turns into calculation. The structure itself matters more than people think. On the surface, dating apps feel open and fair. Anyone can join. But in practice, attention tends to concentrate. A small group gets most of it. The rest barely registers. So the problem isn't that there are no opportunities. The problem is that opportunity and actual access are not the same thing. It looks open, but it doesn't feel reachable. And this is important, because what pushes people out isn't failure. It's the sense that effort and outcome are disconnected. You put in time, energy, money, and what comes back is inconsistent, unpredictable, often nothing. And when that gap gets too wide, people don't explode. They don't protest. They just stop, quietly. But there's another layer to this, and it's easy to miss. In the past, if you wanted connection, there weren't many alternatives. You had to go out, meet people, build relationships. That was the path. Now, that's no longer true. You can stay home. You still get stimulation, entertainment, distraction, even a sense of connection. Games, content, social media. They don't replace real relationships, but they make them easier to delay. And that changes behavior, more than people realize. Because once alternatives exist, the original option has to compete. And right now, relationships are competing against things that are easier, safer, more predictable, and in many cases, more rewarding in the short term. Delayed rewards, emotional risk. Most modern alternatives are the opposite. Instant feedback, low risk, immediate reward. So over time, people don't just avoid relationships, they get used to something else. So the question isn't just, why aren't men choosing relationships? It's also, what are they choosing instead? Now add another layer to this, the economic reality. The US looks wealthy from the outside, but for a lot of men, day-to-day life feels expensive. Rent, housing, healthcare, student loans. Even maintaining a basic lifestyle takes a lot. Now add dating on top of that. Time, money, emotional energy, and then marriage. A much bigger commitment. At some point, the question shifts. Not, can I find someone, but, can I realistically support this life? And then there's the part people don't like to talk about. Divorce. Not the emotional side. Everyone knows that's hard. The structural side. Legal complexity, financial consequences, long-term impact. For some men, marriage doesn't just look like a relationship. It looks like a high-risk contract. Easy to enter, hard to exit. So the calculation becomes clearer. High cost, uncertain return, significant downside. And on top of that, you have the broader cultural tension. Gender expectations, political divisions, conflicting ideas about roles, responsibility, fairness. Things that used to be worked out inside a relationship now show up before it even begins. So instead of two people meeting, it sometimes feels like two frameworks colliding. From a male perspective, that can feel exhausting. Before you even show who you are, you're already being interpreted, positioned, categorized. And when relationships start to feel like constant evaluation, the barrier to entry goes up. So what do men do? They ask a simple question. Is this worth it? Not emotionally, structurally. Time, money, energy, risk. And the answer, for many, is becoming less clear. So they adjust. They try less, delay more, or opt out entirely. Not because they hate relationships, not because they've given up on connection, but because the system, as it is now, doesn't make sense to invest in. And this connects directly to something bigger. If fewer people date, fewer people marry. If fewer people marry, fewer people have children. This isn't just about personal choices. It's an outcome of structure. From the outside, it can look like men are failing, or disengaging, or becoming less capable. But from the inside, it feels different. It feels like a decision, a recalibration. In the past, this was a game you entered even if it was uncertain. Now, for a lot of men, it's starting to look like a game where the numbers don't add up. So when you hear people say, "I can't do it. I can't find anyone. I don't even know if I want to anymore," it's not always about romance. Sometimes it's simpler than that. It doesn't make sense. That's where the shift is. In the next episode, we'll look at Europe. If the US is becoming a place where marriage feels risky and exhausting, Europe is different. In many parts of Europe, it's not that people can't get married. It's that they don't need to. Living together, having children, building a life, without formal marriage, is already normal. So instead of becoming harder, marriage, in some places, is simply becoming less necessary. Europe is different. Not because relationships are easier, and not because men there are somehow more romantic. It's different because, in many parts of Europe, marriage no longer holds the same position it once did. That's the key. In the US, a lot of men seem to look at marriage and think, "This feels too risky." In much of Europe, the thought is often simpler. Why does this need to be marriage at all? And that difference matters. Because once marriage stops feeling necessary, people don't have to reject relationships. They can just bypass the institution. That's what makes Europe different. A lot of people outside Europe still imagine it in older terms. Traditional cities, old churches, long histories, family names. Marriage as a cultural norm. And yes, some of that is still there, but underneath that image, something has shifted. In many parts of Europe, living together without marriage is no longer unusual. Having children without marriage is no longer shocking. Building a life without ever signing the formal contract can be completely normal. So, if you're a man looking at relationships in that environment, the calculation changes. The question is no longer just, "Should I get married?" It becomes, "If I can have the relationship without the institution, why take on the institution?" That sounds cold, but it isn't necessarily cynical. It's structural. And Europe, more than the US, shows what happens when the social meaning of marriage weakens, but the desire for companionship doesn't disappear. That's an important distinction. Because people sometimes hear marriage decline and assume it means relationships are collapsing. That's not always true. Sometimes it means the relationship survives while marriage loses status. Sometimes the couple stays and the institution fades. And once that happens, a lot of old assumptions stop working. For a long time, marriage was treated as the natural endpoint. You date, you commit, you marry, you build a household, you have children. That sequence used to feel normal, expected even. But in much of Europe now, that sequence is weaker. You can live together first, stay together for years, raise children, share finances, build routines, be, in every practical sense, a family without marriage ever happening. And once that becomes socially acceptable, marriage has to justify itself. It can't rely on habit anymore. That changes male decision-making more than people realize. Because if marriage is no longer the gate you have to pass through in order to have intimacy, stability, family life, or even children, then marriage becomes optional in a very literal way. Not symbolic, not rhetorical, actually optional. And once something becomes optional, it has to compete. That's where Europe gets interesting. Because in Europe, for many men, the pressure is often lower than in places where marriage still carries a stronger mandatory feel. There is less sense that you must formalize the relationship in order for it to count. Less sense that adulthood is incomplete without a wedding. Less sense that living together outside marriage marks you as failed or unstable. That doesn't mean every country is the same. Northern and Western Europe tend to be much farther down this path. Southern and Eastern parts of Europe are more mixed. But the broad direction is clear enough. Cohabitation is normal, marriage is later, and in some places, marriage simply loses its monopoly over adult partnership. And that has consequences. Because when men feel less social pressure to marry, they also feel less urgency. And urgency matters. A lot of marriage used to happen not because people had solved every doubt, but because the culture pushed them forward. There was momentum. Friends were marrying. Families expected it. The path felt obvious. Europe, in many places, weakened that momentum. So now, the man who feels uncertain doesn't have to push through that uncertainty. He can simply wait. And sometimes, waiting becomes the new default. This is where Europe differs sharply from the US. In the American case, the story often feels like this: the risk is too high. In the European case, it often feels more like the necessity is too low. And that produces a different mood. Less panic, less overt frustration, less sense of the system being stacked against you in one immediate way, but also less drive to formalize anything. And over time, that matters just as much. Because societies don't need people to hate marriage in order for marriage to weaken. They just need enough people to stop seeing a reason for it. There's another layer, too. The economics are still there. Europe isn't some frictionless utopia. Housing is expensive. Urban life is expensive. Job security is uneven. Young adulthood is often delayed. Eurofound has pointed directly to housing, financial insecurity, and delayed household formation as major pressures on young Europeans. So this is not a story where Europeans simply relax into beautiful, consequence-free cohabitation. There's pressure there too. But the response is different. In the US, pressure can make marriage look dangerous. In Europe, pressure often makes marriage look unnecessary. That distinction matters. Because if your life already feels economically unstable, and your culture no longer insists that marriage is the proper next step, then formal marriage becomes one more thing you can postpone. Not forever, at first. Just for now. But for now can stretch for years, then decades, then sometimes indefinitely. And once cohabitation becomes normalized, marriage loses one of its strongest old arguments. It can no longer say, "This is the only serious form of commitment," because that's no longer believable. People can see committed couples all around them who never married. Couples with homes, children, shared lives, long histories. And if those relationships are visibly real, then the institution has to offer something beyond symbolism. For some men, it doesn't, or at least, not enough. That does not mean European men are all anti-marriage. That would be too simple. A lot of them still want long-term partnership. A lot still want family. A lot still want commitment. But commitment and marriage are no longer identical in their minds. That separation changes everything. Because when commitment can exist without marriage, marriage becomes a secondary question. Not the foundation, an extra layer. And extra layers get cut when people are tired, unsure, or unconvinced. There's also a cultural mood here that's easy to overlook. Europe, in many places, has normalized a quieter form of individual autonomy. Not necessarily the loud, performative individualism you often see in American culture. Something more subdued, more practical, less ideological. The idea that adults should be able to structure their personal lives without too much moral drama. That attitude makes it easier to live together without marrying, easier to separate without scandal, easier to delay decisions without feeling like life has failed. And again, that lowers pressure. Which sounds good, until you realize that lower pressure also means lower momentum. And lower momentum means fewer transitions, fewer weddings, fewer formal commitments, fewer steps from relationship into institution. From a male perspective, this can feel comfortable, and comfort changes behavior. If the relationship already works well enough, if the law or culture already allows a couple to live together, if children are socially accepted outside marriage, if the world around you doesn't demand a wedding, then what exactly is pushing you toward marriage? That is the European question. Not, what if marriage hurts me? But, what exactly is marriage adding here? And the honest answer, for many men, is less and less clear. Maybe legal clarity, maybe symbolism, maybe social recognition. But if those benefits feel abstract while the obligations feel concrete, the motivation weakens. And once motivation weakens, delay becomes easy. Especially for men who are already uncertain, or already somewhat comfortable, or already living in a relationship that functions without the contract. That's why Europe matters in this series. Because Europe shows a different pathway to the same broad outcome. In the US, men may step back because marriage feels high risk. In Europe, men may step back because marriage feels lower value. Same result, different logic. And this is why you can't explain falling marriage with one single theory. Sometimes people withdraw because the institution feels dangerous. Sometimes they withdraw because it feels unnecessary. Sometimes the structure pushes them away. Sometimes it simply stops pulling them in. Europe is the clearest example of the second one, and from there, the demographic consequences still follow. If marriage becomes less central, and long-term commitment gets delayed, and family formation becomes less structured, births tend to fall or shift outside traditional marriage. That doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't mean every unmarried couple is unstable. But it does mean the older sequence, dating, marriage, children, becomes weaker and less universal. And once that old sequence weakens at a societal level, population patterns change with it. So when people talk about Europe, I think they often miss the real story. They assume it's about progress, or decline, or freedom, or moral collapse. Usually some big ideological argument. But a lot of the time, it's simpler than that. Marriage stopped being the only serious path, and once that happened, a lot of men stopped feeling urgency around it. Not because they stopped wanting love, not because they stopped wanting closeness, but because the institution itself lost some of its old practical force. That's the shift. Not the death of relationships, the weakening of marriage as a necessary form. And once necessity fades, behavior follows, quietly. In the next episode, we'll go to East Asia, and that's where the pattern changes again. If America feels risky, and Europe feels optional, East Asia feels heavy. There, marriage often hasn't become unnecessary. It has become expensive, pressurized, difficult to enter. And that leads to a different kind of male withdrawal. East Asia is different. It may be the clearest warning for everyone else, Because here, many people still believe in marriage, and it is struggling anyway. Marriage did not become outdated. It became heavy. That is the key difference. In many parts of East Asia, marriage is still respected. Families still value it. Society still recognizes it. Many still see it as a meaningful milestone of adulthood, and that matters. Because when a society still believes in marriage, but fewer people can realistically enter it, the pressure becomes intense. Wanting something and being able to reach it are not the same thing. For many men, that gap has widened. Because in East Asia, marriage is often tied to a package deal, not just love, housing, income, career stability, savings, status, parental approval, future childcare costs, education costs, long-term sacrifice. And in many places, men are still expected to carry a large share of that burden. Even in modern cities, even in highly educated societies. The language may have changed, but the expectation often remains. Be stable first. Earn enough first. Own something first. Prove yourself first. So for many men, marriage does not feel like one decision. It feels like 20 decisions bundled together, and all of them cost money. That changes behavior. Because when the entry cost becomes too high, people do not always rebel. They delay. Quietly. They tell themselves, not yet. After I earn more. After promotion. After I move. After I save enough. And sometimes not yet lasts 10 years. Then suddenly they are in their late 30s, still waiting. This is one of East Asia's defining patterns. Not rejection, delay. And delay matters more than people think, because marriage has timing, fertility has timing, energy has timing, family formation has timing. When an entire generation delays together, the demographic consequences become severe, and East Asia knows this better than almost anywhere. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China. Some of the world's lowest birth rates emerged in places where marriage became harder to enter. Not because people forgot family, because the path toward family became too steep. Let's start with housing. For many young men in East Asia, housing is not a side issue. It is the issue. A modest apartment can require years of income. Rent can erase savings. Ownership feels distant. And in cultures where housing still symbolizes readiness, that pressure becomes psychological. It is not only, I don't have a home. It becomes, I am not ready to be chosen. That distinction matters, because economic pressure becomes identity pressure. Then there is work. East Asia is known for discipline, productivity, and education. But behind that reputation is another reality. Long hours, high competition, credential pressure, burnout, career insecurity, constant comparison. Many men are not choosing career over marriage. They are trying to survive career first. And by the time survival becomes stable, the relationship market has changed. Age changed. Energy changed. Expectations changed. Time moved faster than expected. Then comes something more subtle. Status expectation. In many East Asian cultures, men are still judged through provision. Not always openly, not always maliciously, often quietly. What do you do? How much do you earn? Can you support a household? Can you buy a place? Can you take care of future parents and children? These questions may sound practical, but over time they become heavy. Because they tell men that love is conditional on performance. And once relationships start to feel like another exam, fatigue follows. But this pressure does not fall on men alone. Many women in East Asia carry their own version of it. Marriage can mean unequal domestic labor, career sacrifice, pressure from in-laws, childcare expectations, loss of freedom. So hesitation grows on both sides, and when both sides hesitate, timing begins to collapse. Now let's talk about China. Because China combines several pressures at once. Urban costs are high, competition is intense, work culture can be brutal, traditional expectations often remain strong. At the same time, China has long dealt with gender imbalance in some generations, leaving more men than women in certain age groups. From the outside, people assume that should simplify marriage markets. It often does not. In some rural regions, many men struggle to marry. In major cities, many women delay marriage. Many men also step back because the financial bar feels too high. So you get a paradox. A country with many men that still has many unmarried men and many unmarried women. Because population numbers alone do not create marriage. Economics, geography, class, and expectations matter more. People often imagine relationships like simple math. More men means harder competition. More women means easier pairing. Real life does not work that way. A man in a rural county is not competing in the same market as a professional in Shanghai. A woman delaying marriage in Beijing is not living the same reality as someone in a smaller city. East Asia often contains multiple marriage markets inside one country, and fragmentation creates frustration. People exist, but timing, location, class, and expectations do not align. South Korea shows another version of pressure. Marriage is still culturally meaningful, but housing costs, education pressure, work intensity, and gender conflict have become major barriers. Many men feel judged economically before they even begin. Many women feel marriage may bring unequal domestic burdens or career sacrifice. So both sides hesitate. And when both sides hesitate, the result can look like indifference. Often it is exhaustion. Japan shows a quieter version. Less dramatic conflict, more slow withdrawal. Long work culture, decades of economic stagnation, social reserve, and changing habits all contributed to later marriage and more single adults. Some men did not choose isolation. They slowly adapted to it. Work, hobbies, private life, low-risk comfort. And once a quiet life becomes stable enough, the motivation to disrupt it weakens. This is why East Asia matters, because it reveals something different from America or Europe. In America, men may step back because marriage feels risky. In Europe, men may step back because marriage feels optional. In East Asia, men often step back because marriage feels too heavy to lift. That weight can be financial. It can be cultural. It can be emotional. Usually, it is all three at once. And here is the tragedy of that structure. Many men in East Asia do not reject marriage in principle. Many still want love, still want family, still want children. That part never disappeared. What changed was the path toward it. But wanting becomes irrelevant when entry feels unreachable. That creates a painful outcome. Not rebellion, not liberation, blocked desire. So they adapt, they delay, work longer, lower expectations, spend on hobbies, stay with parents longer, live smaller lives, say maybe later, and later becomes never, quietly. This also changes women's behavior. When men delay, women delay. When women delay, men delay further. Trust weakens, timing narrows, standards harden, hope becomes cautious. Then society calls it selfishness. Often it is structure. From the outside, East Asia can look highly successful. Safe cities, modern infrastructure, strong education, high order. But beneath that success, many young adults feel squeezed. and marriage becomes one of the first things sacrificed. Because when survival is expensive, long-term commitments become luxury goods. Marriage did not disappear. It became premium. And premium goods sell less when wages lag, stress rises, and confidence falls. That is where the birth crisis connects. If marriage is delayed, births are delayed. If marriage is blocked, births collapse. If relationships become another arena of pressure, people withdraw from the arena. Quietly. When family becomes expensive, society gets lonely. So when you hear someone say, they just don't want commitment, that may be true for some, but for many others, the truth is less dramatic. They wanted it. They just could not carry the weight. That is the East Asian version of male withdrawal. Not anger, not indifference, burden. In the next episode, we'll step back and look at the bigger picture. Because America, Europe, and East Asia all reached similar outcomes, through very different roads. And once you see that, you stop blaming individuals so quickly. You start looking at systems. People keep asking what's wrong with men. Why are men not committing? Why are they not marrying? Why are they stepping back? That question assumes the problem is inside people. But women are stepping back too, just from a different angle. What if the problem isn't personal at all? If completely different cultures produce the same direction of change, the cause is probably not character. It's probably structure. Let me show you what I mean. In the US, marriage feels risky. In 2023, the marriage rate hit 6.0 per 1,000, less than half of what it was in 1970. Not because people stopped wanting love, because the contract around it changed. Divorce doesn't just end a relationship. It can mean asset division, alimony, custody battles, consequences that last years after the feeling is gone. Meanwhile, dating shifted into an attention market. Apps made everyone visible, but visibility isn't selection. A small percentage absorbs most of the interest. The rest send messages into silence. Effort doesn't guarantee outcomes. And when outcomes feel random, people start questioning whether the game is worth playing. Now add economic pressure. Median home price passed $400,000, student debt passed $1.7 trillion, healthcare tied to employment. And marriage stops looking like a relationship. It starts looking like a contract, with unclear upside and very clear downside. So men hesitate. And increasingly, so do women. In Europe, marriage feels optional. In France, over 60% of children are born outside marriage. In Sweden, the number is similar. Not because families collapsed, because the institution lost its monopoly. The state absorbed many of the functions marriage once held. Cohabiting partners get legal protection. Children born outside marriage carry no stigma. Social safety nets don't require a ring. You can live together, raise children, build a life, without signing anything. When marriage becomes one option among many, it has to justify itself against the alternatives. And for a lot of people, the alternatives are good enough. They don't reject it, they just don't need it. So they delay, or never arrive. In East Asia, marriage still carries weight. Respected, expected, culturally meaningful. But it got expensive. In South Korea, the term spec originally meant resume qualifications. Now it applies to marriage. Housing in Seoul, stable income, career trajectory, family approval, education plans for children who don't exist yet. Marriage isn't one decision, it's a checklist. And until every box is checked, the door doesn't open. In China, bride price expectations persist across regions. In Japan, long work hours leave little room for dating, let alone building a partnership. And women across the region are renegotiating too. Because marriage can still mean unequal domestic labor, career sacrifice, the expectation to disappear into a household. South Korea's feminist movement didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from those terms. Both sides are hesitating, for different reasons, at the same gate. 3 regions, 3 different pressures, same direction. Not because of one universal cause, but because structural friction, wherever it appears, produces the same behavioral response: withdrawal. The pattern runs on 4 axes. Cost goes up. Not just money, time, energy, opportunity. The price of being wrong. Risk goes up. Not just divorce, uncertainty about roles, about fairness, about what happens when things fall apart. Trust goes down. Not just in people, in the system, the rules, the expectations, the predictability of outcomes. When people don't trust the structure, they hesitate to commit inside it. Alternatives increase. You don't need a partner to fill your evening anymore. Work, screens, hobbies, loose social networks. None of them replace intimacy, but they reduce the urgency to find it. The US scores highest on risk. Europe scores highest on alternatives. East Asia scores highest on cost. All 3 are moving on all 4 axes, just at different speeds. And once urgency disappears, everything slows down. Fewer meetings, fewer relationships, fewer commitments, then fewer families, then fewer children. This gets called a birth rate problem, but that's the last domino. The first one fell much earlier. For a long time, marriage was carried by systems. Stable jobs that started at 22 and lasted. Housing you could afford on a single income. Shared cultural scripts that told you when, how, and with whom. Those systems bore part of the weight of commitment. The individual only had to show up. Now the systems have thinned, and the full weight falls on 2 people, who have to negotiate everything from scratch. Roles, finances, labor, identity, with no template and no safety net. That's not a moral failing. That's a design problem. So the real question is not, how do we convince people to marry? The real question is, how do we make commitment make sense again? You cannot shame people into families. You cannot guilt people into risk. People respond to incentives, to structure, to reality. And right now, reality is saying, be careful. This is not collapse. This is withdrawal. Quiet, rational, distributed. No protests, no dramatic refusal. Just fewer people choosing the path, year after year, until the road is empty and someone finally asks where everyone went. America made marriage feel risky. Europe made marriage feel optional. East Asia made marriage feel heavy. Different roads, same destination. This was never just about men, and it was never just about women. It was about the structures. People are expected to build a life inside, and whether those structures still deserve that trust. So, what does it look like where you live? Does this feel accurate or completely different? Thanks for watching.